Hello, I'm Ed Gramlich with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and this is part 3 of getting to know the National Housing Trust Fund law and regulations. Part 3 will discuss how the trust fund will be distributed within the states. Some of the topics we'll be talking about is designation of a state agency, the sub-grantee option, and the National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan, which, as you can see, has a number of key components to it. The allocation plan is a very, very important process and document, and as advocates, we urge you to get actively involved throughout the entire allocation plan process. Now, as you probably recall from part 1, the National Housing Trust Fund is a block grant to the states. It's not going to go to cities and counties the way home and CDBG money do. So through this block grant, how will the trust fund money be allocated within states? The trust fund law requires the states to designate a state agency, such as a housing finance agency, a housing department, or a tribally designated housing entity. Once a designated entity has been selected, then that agency or entity will receive the trust fund money from the state and HUD and operate the state's National Housing Trust Fund program. It's important for advocates to know whether or not your state has already decided which agency will administer the trust fund. As you can see from this list dated March 10th, about 30 states had designated an entity sometime between 2009 and this date. Since this list has been compiled, HUD in February of this year, 2015, gave states very specific instructions on how to designate an entity, and a lot of these states have not yet actually gone through the motions of submitting a formal letter from their governor or from their state legislature to indicate which of their entities within that state is the designated entity. In addition to this 30 here, there are another 10 that have since been added officially to HUD's list. So check periodically with your state and with the HUD list. Now, if your state had made a designation way back when, in let's say 2010, it's entirely possible that the governor has changed, and there may be an opportunity for you to approach your governor or your state legislature and suggest a different state entity that you think is going to be more responsive to the needs of extremely low-income renters. If your state has not designated an entity, then be sure to advocate at the state level, either at the governor or at the state legislature, depending on how your state works. Advocate for the state agency that you think is going to be most responsive to the needs of extremely low-income renters. So, in addition to the law requiring a state designation of an entity, the interim regulation comes up with something called a sub-grantee option. The National Housing Trust Fund doesn't distribute money to states the way home and CDBG formulas do, but the interim rule allows states to allocate trust fund money to something called a sub-grantee. And a sub-grantee can be a local government or some other state entity. If your state chooses to use sub-grantees, these local governments, then that sub-grantee would administer part or all of your state's National Housing Trust Fund allocation. As advocates, it would be really important for you to help your state decide whether or not you want sub-grantees used in your state, or if you want to have the National Housing Trust Fund operated solely out of a state-designated entity. And the way you kind of weigh in on that is by influencing the allocation plan. The trust fund law requires states to prepare a National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan every year. That allocation plan has to show how the state intends to distribute its trust fund money in the upcoming year. And that distribution of trust fund money must be based on the priority housing needs that are indicated in your state's consolidated plan. The interim rule requires trust fund money to be distributed throughout the state. Now, this could be somewhat problematic in the first few years of the National Housing Trust Fund when there's relatively little money in the trust fund, and many states are only going to be getting, let's say, $3 million. Presumably, HUD will figure out a way to be rational about the fact that that small amount of money cannot instantly be distributed throughout the states until we get a significant amount of money in the National Housing Trust Fund. The rule also requires the National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan to be integrated into your state's consolidated plan. And in order for any local subgrantee to get National Housing Trust Fund money from its state, that local subgrantee must have its own local National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan woven into its local consolidated plan. When preparing an allocation plan, the law requires the state to tell the public, notify the public that it's preparing a draft allocation plan, and the law requires the state to provide for public comment and to consider public comments. The law also requires compliance with the consolidated plan public participation regulations, which are somewhat detailed. They're not ideal, but they're fairly detailed, and so be sure you're aware of those public participation requirements in the trust in the consolidated plan regulations. And finally, the interim rule inserts the National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan regulations in the consolidated plan regulations. So if you go to the National Housing Trust Fund regulations at Part 93, you will not see anything about the allocation plan directly. You have to go to Part 91, the consolidated plan regulations. And they are laid out there. Some tips for advocates. The action around the allocation plan begins at the state level. And it might then filter down to the local level if your state chooses to use subgrantees. Advocates who are only accustomed to common plan advocacy at the local level, given their experience with CDBG and HOME, are going to have to learn how to advocate at the state level in order to really influence how trust fund money will be used in your state and perhaps in your locality. And also be aware that the state common plan agency in some places is going to be different than the National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan agency that is usually the designated agency. So be aware of some potential differences there and help your state work so that both plans are harmonious. In addition to describing how the trust fund money will be distributed throughout the state, the allocation plan must also describe the requirements that so-called recipients must meet when those recipients apply to their state for trust fund money. Recipients could be nonprofits, for-profits, or other public entities. States and any local subgrantees will allocate trust fund money to these recipients, and these recipients are going to be the entities that actually do the bricks and mortar work. They're going to be doing the rehabilitation or the development of affordable rental housing for extremely low-income households. It's really important for people to be aware that the law and the regulations require that any recipients have a very extensive development capacity related to the kinds of projects that they're seeking trust fund money for, and that they have significant financial capacity. The law and the regulations are very strict about that. The allocation plan must give priority to awarding money to projects based on 6 factors, and these are laid out in the statute as well as in the regulations. First criteria is geographic diversity, as reflected in your state's consolidated plan, or perhaps your local consolidated plan. Second, the extent to which rents are affordable, especially to extremely low-income households. 3 is the length of time that apartments will remain affordable. 4th is the merit of a project. The word merit is actually in the statute, but doesn't go any further than that. The interim regulation gives some examples of what might be meritorious kinds of projects. It's not limited to what's in the interim regulations, but the interim regulations suggest that projects that are housing that is serving people with special needs is one example, housing that is accessible to transit or employment opportunities, or housing that has energy saving or non-polluting features might be the kinds of projects that you might consider having merit and therefore priority. But there may be other kinds of projects that you think have great merit and therefore should have priority in your allocation plan. And you should weigh in the public comment period about your annual allocation plan to make sure that the kinds of projects that you think are important get high priority. The other remaining criteria are the applicant's ability to actually use the money and carry out projects in a timely way, and the extent to which the project will use non-federal funds. And for example, if you have a local trust fund that you will use to match with the National Housing Trust Fund, that ought to give you a leg up in terms of priority consideration. Given a couple of these criteria, advocates will want to ask, will the rent be affordable? A basic policy in housing is the Brooke Rule, which considers housing affordable only if households spend no more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Neither the trust fund law nor HUD's rule, however, cap resident rent and utility payments at 30% of their income. Instead, HUD's rule would set a maximum rent, including utilities, that a household pays at a fixed amount, and that fixed amount would be 30% times 30% of the area median income, or 30% of the poverty level, whichever is greater. So kind of think of it as like a tax credit rent level. That's the maximum contract rent that a house that an owner can charge a renter. So 30% and 30% might still be unaffordable to many extremely low-income households, particularly those who have SSI level incomes. In the preamble to the proposed rule, HUD recognizes that by setting this kind of fixed rent, many people might actually be spending more than 30% of their income for rent and utilities, have a cost burden, and maybe even a severe cost burden. However, HUD thinks that this fixed rent is necessary so that owners and lenders can budget for future revenues based on that stream of fixed known rents. Now, just because it says the maximum fixed rent is 30% times 30% doesn't mean that an owner can figure out a way to charge a rent that is more affordable. Let's say 30% times 20% of the area median income, or something lower like that. As advocates, we would hope that you would try to convince your state or local subgrantee to require the Brooke Rule for any projects that a recipient proposes to receive trust fund money for. Or if not require it, at least give projects that do have Brooke rents priority in consideration when funding among all the projects that are being submitted for applications. And the trust fund law helps you with that. The trust fund law says the extent to which rental homes are affordable to extremely low-income households is one factor that a state or local government must consider when awarding trust fund monies to a proposed project. Another question you might ask is, how long will those rents remain affordable? The interim regulations require that for both renter housing and homeowner housing, that the assisted units remain affordable for a minimum of 30 years. The interim regulations say that states and local governments can set longer affordability periods. For advocates, we would hope that you would try to convince your state or local subgrantee in the allocation process to set an affordability period of at least 50 years and perhaps longer. And again, the statute helps you with that. The law says how long trust fund rental homes will remain affordable is one factor that state or any local government must consider when awarding National Housing Trust Fund dollars to a proposed project. So that's an overview of that part of the law and the regulations. As the months roll on, we might be adding more material. Check our website periodically. Here is HUD's website. HUD will be putting out advice and guidance as the year rolls along. Check with that periodically. You can always write or call me to ask questions, make suggestions, tell me what's going on in your state. And if you're not a member of the National Income Housing Coalition, we would hope that you would become a member, because we really depend on our members to help our advocacy efforts. So hopefully this has been helpful. If you haven't already seen parts 1 and 2, please check those out, and also check out parts 4 and 5. Thank you.